In June 1944, the Allies launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day. Thousands of ships crossed the English Channel as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. The cost was immense, but it marked the beginning of the end for Axis power in Europe. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, U.S. forces pushed back island by island, from Saipan to the Philippines. The war machine that had once conquered now found itself surrounded and shrinking. The world held its breath as both fronts moved closer to the final reckoning. By early 1945, the Axis powers were collapsing. In Europe, Allied forces closed in from the west as Soviet troops advanced from the east. Cities lay in ruins, and millions of lives had been lost. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the guns finally fell silent. But in the Pacific, the war raged on. It would end only after unimaginable devastation, when 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II had ended, but humanity was forever changed. When the war ended, silence filled the air, a silence heavier than the roar of any gun. More than 70 million lives had been lost. Entire cities were gone, families erased, nations divided. From the ashes, the world faced a question that still echoes today. How do you rebuild after destroying so much? In the heart of Europe, refugees walked roads that once led to battlefields. Japan lay in ruins, yet the spirit to rebuild had already begun. And in America, soldiers returned home to a new world, one filled with both opportunity and anxiety. The war was over, but peace would not come easily. The Cold War began, as former allies became rivals, and humanity stood once again at the edge of fear. World War II was more than a conflict, it was a warning. It showed what happens when hate goes unchallenged, when fear replaces understanding, and when power is valued more than humanity. From the rubble rose the United Nations, human rights movements, and a collective promise: never again. But that promise must be renewed by every generation, because history doesn't just live in textbooks, it lives in the choices we make every day. The Second World War reshaped our planet, our politics, and our sense of morality. It taught us that unity is fragile, that freedom has a cost, and that peace is never permanent. It must be protected. Each time we remember this war, we honor not just the soldiers, but every civilian who lived through it. Their pain, their courage, and their resilience remind us of who we are and who we must never become again. The lessons of the past are not buried in the ruins of history. They speak to us, softly, urgently, asking only that we listen. In June 1944, the Allies launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day. Thousands of ships crossed the English Channel as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. The cost was immense, but it marked the beginning of the end for Axis power in Europe. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, U.S. forces pushed back island by island, from Saipan to the Philippines. The war machine that had once conquered now found itself surrounded and shrinking. The world held its breath as both fronts moved closer to the final reckoning. By early 1945, the Axis powers were collapsing. In Europe, Allied forces closed in from the west as Soviet troops advanced from the east. Cities lay in ruins, and millions of lives had been lost. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the guns finally fell silent. But in the Pacific, the war raged on. It would end only after unimaginable devastation, when 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II had ended, but humanity was forever changed. When the war ended, silence filled the air, a silence heavier than the roar of any gun. More than 70 million lives had been lost. Entire cities were gone, families erased, nations divided. From the ashes, the world faced a question that still echoes today. How do you rebuild after destroying so much? In the heart of Europe, refugees walked roads that once led to battlefields. Japan lay in ruins, yet the spirit to rebuild had already begun. And in America, soldiers returned home to a new world, one filled with both opportunity and anxiety. The war was over, but peace would not come easily. The Cold War began, as former allies became rivals, and humanity stood once again at the edge of fear. World War II was more than a conflict, it was a warning. It showed what happens when hate goes unchallenged, when fear replaces understanding, and when power is valued more than humanity. From the rubble rose the United Nations, human rights movements, and a collective promise: never again. But that promise must be renewed by every generation, because history doesn't just live in textbooks, it lives in the choices we make every day. The Second World War reshaped our planet, our politics, and our sense of morality. It taught us that unity is fragile, that freedom has a cost, and that peace is never permanent. It must be protected. Each time we remember this war, we honor not just the soldiers, but every civilian who lived through it. Their pain, their courage, and their resilience remind us of who we are and who we must never become again. The lessons of the past are not buried in the ruins of history. They speak to us, softly, urgently, asking only that we listen.
The founding of America. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the world fade. Tonight, we drift back through time to a moment when America was not yet a country, not even a dream, just an idea carried across an endless ocean. It is the early 1600s. The world is vast, cold, and filled with uncertainty. Across the dark waters of the Atlantic, 3 small ships sail: the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. Inside, 100 English settlers huddled together, seasick, exhausted, and afraid. They have left behind everything they know: their homes, their families, their safety, all for a promise whispered across the sea. A new world, a new beginning. After months of storms and hunger, they finally glimpse land. Thick forests stretch along the coast. The air smells of salt and pine. They have arrived in Virginia, and they name their new home Jamestown. But the new world is not kind. Food runs out quickly. Winter brings hunger and death. Half of them will never see another spring. The rest survive only by the grace of native tribes nearby, whose knowledge of the land keeps them alive. The settlers plant, build, and learn slowly. They carve homes out of wilderness. They pray for strength, not knowing that their struggle will become the foundation of something far greater than they can imagine. As the decades pass, more ships cross the ocean. 13 colonies rise along the eastern coast, each with its own dreams, its own people, its own voice. Some come for wealth, others for freedom, and some for survival. The North grows with trade and industry, the South with plantations and labor. Differences emerge, small at first, but growing with every year. Yet through all their struggles, a single idea begins to grow, that they are not just subjects of a king, but people of a new land. By the early 1700s, that idea begins to stir louder. The colonies prosper, but their wealth is tied to Britain, and Britain takes its share. Taxes rise, control tightens, and the voices of discontent begin to echo through taverns and markets. Why should we pay taxes to a king who does not even know our names? The cry grows louder. No taxation without representation. At first, it is only talk. Then, it becomes protest. In 1773, in the cold night of Boston Harbor, a group of men disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. They board British ships, and one by one, they throw crates of tea into the dark water below. The Boston Tea Party. It is not a war, not yet, but it is the spark that will ignite one. Britain answers with force. Soldiers march through the colonies, redcoats flashing beneath gray skies. And in 1775, in the towns of Lexington and Concord, the first gunshots echo, shots that will be remembered for centuries. The revolution has begun. At first, it seems impossible. How can farmers defeat an empire? How can blacksmiths and carpenters stand against trained soldiers with bayonets and cannons? But the colonies do not fight for power. They fight for freedom, and freedom is stronger than fear. Through bitter winters and endless battles, they hold on. They lose friends, homes, and sons, but they keep believing that a nation of their own can exist. Then, on a warm July day in 1776, a group of men gather in a hall in Philadelphia. Thomas Jefferson dips his quill in ink. He writes the words that will change history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence is signed. A rebellion becomes a revolution. A collection of colonies becomes a country, at least in spirit. But victory will take years. The war drags on, through icy fields, muddy roads, and starving camps. In the snow of Valley Forge, men stand barefoot, their hands blue with cold, their hearts burning with faith. George Washington, their commander, rides through the frost-covered camp. He says little, but his presence reminds them why they fight, for a home, for a voice, for a future their children will inherit. Finally, in 1783, the war ends. The Treaty of Paris is signed. Britain recognizes the United States of America. The dream, impossible only years ago, has come true. The new nation stands trembling like a newborn. No king, no crown, only ideas, ink, and courage. But peace is fragile. The colonies are divided. They have no common currency, no army, no unity. Freedom, they realize, is not the end of struggle. It is the beginning. They gather again in Philadelphia in a hot summer of 1787 to write something new, something that will hold them together. The Constitution. It is not perfect, but it is bold. It begins with 3 simple words: we the people. And so a nation begins, not born of bloodlines or crowns, but of belief.
The founding of America was not a single event, but 1,000 small moments of courage, 1,000 whispers of freedom carried across the wind of centuries. And even now, when you close your eyes, you can almost hear them. The sails creaking, the drums of revolution beating softly, the pen scratching on parchment, and the voice of a new world being born. Sleep now, and dream of those who dared to dream first.
World War II, the American Awakening. The year is 1941. The sun rises quietly over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Sailors laugh, write letters home, drink coffee. The world feels at peace for one last moment. Then the sky roars. Japanese planes dive from the clouds. Bombs fall like thunder. Ships explode in fire. America wakes up. The attack on Pearl Harbor shakes the nation to its core. Within hours, President Roosevelt speaks to the world. A date which will live in infamy. The next day, America declares war. The isolation ends. The Great Depression ends. A new storm begins. Factories that once stood silent now roar again. Men enlist. Women take jobs in shipyards, factories, and offices. They become the heartbeat of the home front. Strong, determined, unstoppable. The war spreads across the globe, Europe, Africa, the Pacific. America fights on two fronts, against tyranny and terror. Soldiers march through deserts, fly across oceans, and storm beaches half a world away. Each letter home carries the same line: "I'll be back when it's over." In 1944, the world holds its breath. The greatest invasion in history begins. D-Day. Thousands of ships cross the English Channel. American soldiers land on the beaches of Normandy. The sea turns red, but they push forward, inch by inch, toward victory. In the Pacific, another war rages. The jungles of Guadalcanal, the mountains of Iwo Jima, the islands that became graves. Each battle is a storm of courage and sacrifice. By 1945, the world is exhausted. Germany falls. Hitler is gone. And then, in a flash of blinding light over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war ends. Silence. Then cheers. Then tears. America has changed forever. Soldiers return home, haunted but hopeful. The world is safe again, but the cost is beyond measure. Over 400,000 Americans never come back. Yet from their sacrifice, a new world begins. Out of the ruins of war, America rises stronger. It becomes a symbol, not just of power, but of possibility. The factories remain. The soldiers become students. Families move into new homes. Babies are born into peace. It's the start of something new, the American century. The modern dream, how America kept its light alive. The 1950s arrive with shining cars, rock and roll, and the glow of television screens. But beneath the surface, change stirs again. The world is no longer divided by war, but by fear, the Cold War. The Soviet Union rises as a rival.
Nuclear weapons hang over humanity like shadows. Children practice hiding under desks. The sky is no longer safe. Yet, even in fear, America dreams. A young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. marches for equality. He speaks not with anger, but with vision. I have a dream. The civil rights movement becomes the new revolution. The fight for freedom continues, not on battlefields, but in hearts and minds. In 1969, the impossible happens. From the quiet of a Florida launch pad, a rocket rises into the stars. Neil Armstrong steps onto the moon and says, "One small step for man, one giant leap."
For the first time, the mighty United States seems helpless. Unemployment rises to 25%. 1 out of every 4 Americans has no work. And yet, life must go on. Across the country, makeshift villages appear, small shacks made from scrap metal and cardboard. They call them Hoovervilles, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover. At night, fires burn in barrels to keep warm. Men share stories of better times. Children sleep to the sound of train whistles. The dream of the 1920s has turned into a nightmare. In the Midwest, the earth itself rebels. A drought begins in 1930. Year after year, the soil turns to dust. The sky darkens with dirt storms. Farms vanish under layers of sand. This is the Dust Bowl. Farmers pack their lives into trucks and head west to California, searching for a future that doesn't exist. In the darkness, a new voice rises, a man with calm confidence, a cigarette in his hand, and hope in his words. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In 1933, he becomes president. He speaks to the nation through the radio, his fireside chats. "The only thing we have to fear," he says, "is fear itself." And people believe him. Roosevelt launches a plan, the New Deal. It's bold, experimental, and human. Men are hired to build roads, dams, and parks. Artists paint murals, writers document stories, farmers receive help. America begins to move again, slowly, painfully, but forward. The government becomes not just a rule, but a helping hand. By 1935, things start to change. The banks stabilize, factories reopen, the dollar strengthens. But the scars remain. A generation grows up learning the value of every penny, every meal, every job. And far across the ocean, new storms begin to gather. While America rebuilds, Europe trembles under the rise of dictators. A man named Hitler speaks of conquest and revenge. In Italy, Mussolini dreams of empire. In Japan, the army moves across Asia. The world has not healed, it is only paused. By the late 1930s, America is still weary, but wiser. Factories begin producing again, this time weapons and supplies. The Great Depression slowly ends, not through prosperity, but through the approach of war. The people who had nothing are now asked to give everything. When World War II begins, America remembers the hunger, the fear, the silence of the 1930s. And so, they work harder, fight stronger, and never again take freedom for granted. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic collapse. It was a test of endurance, of community, of the human spirit. It taught America something money never could, that courage and compassion are the true wealth of a nation. As you drift to sleep tonight, imagine the faint sound of an old radio, crackling through time, playing Roosevelt's voice softly.
Together, we cannot fail. And with that gentle assurance, the lights of the 1930s fade away, leaving behind the calm of a nation that fell, but
The Civil War, a nation divided. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let time roll backward again, back to a century after America was born. The dream of freedom still shines bright, but shadows have grown long across the land. The year is 1860. America is no longer a fragile experiment. It is a vast, growing country. But beneath the surface, the nation is splitting in two. The North hums with factories, progress, and immigration. The South thrives on cotton, plantations, and slavery. Two worlds, bound by a single flag, yet separated by belief. For years, leaders tried to hold the Union together. Compromises are made, laws are passed, but the question of slavery, right or wrong, will not stay silent. In November of 1860, a tall man from Illinois is elected president, Abraham Lincoln. His words are calm, but his ideas are powerful. No man should live in chains. To the southern states, his election feels like a threat. They fear their way of life will be destroyed. One by one, they secede, breaking away from the Union and forming the Confederate States of America. By April 1861, the first cannon fires at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Smoke rises above the harbor, and America enters its darkest night. The war is unlike anything the young nation has ever seen. Brother fights brother. Neighbors turn against neighbors. The fields of Virginia, Tennessee, and Georgia become graves of both North and South. The Union fights for unity and freedom. The Confederacy fights for independence and survival. And in between them lies the soul of America. The battles are endless. Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg. Each name will echo through time, carved into stone, whispered in history books. At Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, more than 20,000 men fall. Fields turn red, and the sun sets over silence. Lincoln walks the halls of the White House, weighed down by grief. He writes letters to mothers who have lost their sons. He prays for the war to end, but he knows it cannot. Not yet. In 1863, Lincoln takes a step that changes everything. He signs the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate states are now and forever free. The war is no longer just about union, it is about humanity. From that moment, the struggle gains new meaning. Black men join the Union Army. They fight not only for their country, but for their freedom. At Gettysburg, the turning point arrives. For 3 long days, the hills and fields of Pennsylvania become the stage of destiny. When the smoke clears, the Confederate Army begins to fall back. Months later, Lincoln stands on that same battlefield. His speech is short, barely 2 minutes, but its words are immortal. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The war continues 2 more years. Marching, dying, waiting. Cities burn, families starve, the nation bleeds. And then in April 1865, the sound of gunfire fades. General Robert E. Lee surrenders to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse.
After 4 years, the war is finally over. But the cost, over 600,000 lives, is almost too heavy to bear. Lincoln does not live to see the healing. Only days after the victory, he is shot in a theater. As he takes his last breath, a soldier outside whispers, "Now he belongs to the ages." The Civil War ends, but the pain does not. The South lies in ruins. The nation must rebuild, not just its cities, but its heart. The slaves are free, but freedom is fragile. The journey toward equality will take generations. Yet even in the ruins, hope flickers. A country once divided slowly begins to heal. The flag rises again, not as a symbol of victory, but of endurance. The Union stands. America survives. And though the war sleeps in history, its lessons still breathe. In every struggle for justice, in every voice that demands freedom. Sleep now as the echoes of that old war fade away. The cannon fire grows distant, the cries soften, and only the wind remains, carrying the quiet reminder that liberty is never free, but always worth the fight.
When the Second World War ended in 1945, the world finally took a breath, but that breath was filled with smoke. Cities across Europe lay in ruins. Millions were dead. And in that silence of victory, two powers emerged from the ashes: the United States of America and the Soviet Union. They had fought together against Nazi Germany, but their friendship was built on necessity, not trust. As soon as Hitler's empire collapsed, the world split again, not by bombs this time, but by beliefs. The United States stood for democracy and capitalism, a world of open markets, freedom, and private enterprise. The Soviet Union stood for communism, a classless society ruled by collective power and strict control. Two dreams, two systems, one fragile planet. The tension between them was invisible, but everywhere, whispered in speeches, drawn on maps, and printed in newspapers. No war had been declared, but both nations knew this was only the beginning of a new kind of war. A war without battlefields, fought through fear, spies, and the silent threat of the atomic bomb. In August 1945, the world had witnessed horror unlike any other. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had ended one war and begun another. America had proven its ultimate weapon. The Soviet Union wanted one too. By 1949, they had it. And suddenly, the world realized one wrong move could end humanity. The late 1940s became a time of paranoia and propaganda. School children in America practiced duck and cover drills under their desks. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards. Movies and posters warned citizens to watch out for communists. The Red Scare had begun. In Washington, Senator Joseph McCarthy became the face of fear, accusing actors, teachers, even generals of being Soviet spies. Careers were destroyed. Trust was shattered. In a way, fear itself became a weapon. While the people trembled, the superpowers began their global chess game. Europe was divided by an Iron Curtain, a term coined by Winston Churchill in 1946. To the west lay freedom. To the east, the shadow of Soviet influence. In response, America formed the Marshall Plan, sending billions in aid to rebuild Western Europe, not just out of kindness, but strategy. A strong, prosperous Europe meant a strong barrier against communism. The Soviet Union saw this as an act of aggression, economic warfare. The Cold War had officially taken shape. In 1949, the tension turned physical.
The Soviet-backed communist forces won in Korea, forming the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong. The balance of power shifted. America felt surrounded. The U.S. responded by forming NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance to protect the West. In reply, the Soviets would later form their own bloc, the Warsaw Pact. Then came 1950. On a quiet Korean peninsula, the Cold War turned hot. North Korea, supported by the Soviets and later China, invaded South Korea. The United States and the United Nations intervened. For the first time, the two ideologies clashed with real blood. The Korean War was brutal. Millions dead, families divided, cities burned to ashes. And after 3 years of fighting, the borders ended up almost exactly where they began. Nothing changed, except the world's realization this rivalry could destroy everything. Back home, America's culture began to shift. The 1950s brought television, rock and roll, and the dream of suburban peace. But beneath the calm smile of the American dream, there was always the hum of the atomic clock. Every technological achievement, from jet planes to space satellites, carried a military shadow. Even science became a weapon. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite in space. For the first time, an American child could look up at the night sky and see proof. The enemy was above them. Fear turned to urgency. President Eisenhower responded by creating NASA, and the space race began. The Cold War was no longer just about land or bombs. It was about the future of humanity. By the early 1960s, both sides had nuclear arsenals powerful enough to destroy the planet many times over. And when John F. Kennedy took office, he inherited a world trembling between pride and panic. The stage was set for one of the most dangerous moments in human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the point where the Cold War nearly turned into World War III.
October 1962. The world held its breath. A small island, only 90 miles from the coast of Florida, became the center of the universe, Cuba. American spy planes had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being built there, each one capable of reaching Washington, New York, or Chicago in minutes. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. President John F. Kennedy faced off against Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. No one slept. No one knew if tomorrow would come. In secret meetings and tense negotiations, messages flew back and forth. American ships formed a blockade around Cuba. Soviet submarines lurked beneath the waves. Every second felt like the last. But, in the end, humanity stepped back from the cliff. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles, and Kennedy quietly promised to withdraw American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended, but both leaders knew there might not be another escape next time. The world had looked into the abyss and survived. After Cuba, a strange calm fell over the world. Not peace, but exhaustion. Both sides began to realize if this Cold War ever turned hot, there would be no winners. So, the race changed direction. From weapons to influence, from destruction to control. The 1960s and 70s became a battlefield of culture, ideology, and space. America sent men to the moon. The Soviets celebrated their own victories in science and sport. Every success was a message, our system works better. But beneath the competition, people on both sides dreamed of something simpler, a world without fear. In America, the Cold War years were also a time of transformation. The civil rights movement rose. While the government fought communism abroad, its own citizens were fighting for equality at home.
Martin Luther King Jr. marched through Washington as the world watched. His dream of freedom and justice echoed beyond America's borders, a reminder that true power comes from moral courage, not nuclear stockpiles. Meanwhile, the war that America could not escape, Vietnam, dragged on. It was meant to stop the spread of communism, but it became a wound, splitting the nation, shaking its faith, and showing the world that even a superpower could bleed. Television brought war into every living room. The images of burning villages and fallen soldiers became symbols of doubt. For many Americans, the greatest enemy wasn't the Soviet Union. It was the fear that they might no longer be the heroes. As the 1970s dawned, both nations searched for balance. Talks of détente, a relaxation of tension, began. Leaders signed treaties to limit nuclear weapons. Handshake photos filled newspapers. But in the shadows, the rivalry never died. Every spy mission, every coded message, every whisper in the dark reminded the world peace was only temporary. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. It was meant to be quick. It became their Vietnam. The United States secretly armed Afghan rebels, turning the desert into another silent battlefield of the Cold War. And in that chaos, a new generation of militants learned to fight, a legacy that would shape the future in unexpected ways. By the 1980s, the world had changed again. A new president, Ronald Reagan, entered the White House, confident, charismatic, and determined to end the Cold War on America's terms. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He rebuilt the military, poured billions into defense, and launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to build lasers and satellites that could stop nuclear missiles. Many saw it as fantasy, but in Moscow, it felt like a threat. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev, a new kind of Soviet leader, young, bold, and willing to change. He introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, reform. He loosened the chains of the old Soviet system and, without realizing it, began its collapse. Walls began to crack, literally. In 1989, after decades of division, citizens of East Germany rose up. They climbed over the Berlin Wall, the very symbol of the Cold War. Families reunited. Tears fell like rain. And the world cheered, because it wasn't just a wall that fell. It was fear itself. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union, once the mightiest empire on Earth, ceased to exist. Its flag lowered for the last time over the Kremlin. 15 new nations emerged from its shadow. The Cold War was over. No treaties, no fireworks, just silence. A 45-year war, fought through fear, pride, and power, had ended without a single nuclear shot. For America, it was victory, but also reflection. The enemy had vanished, but the world remained fragile, haunted by the weapons both sides had built. The Cold War left scars not on land, but in minds. A generation that learned to live under the shadow of destruction and still chose to dream. In the quiet after the storm, the story of the Cold War became a lesson that power without wisdom is peril, and fear without understanding is madness. The world survived the Age of Fire not because of strength, but because, in the end, people remembered to be human.